This episode of Bullet Heaven was made possible by Nyu-Media. We've taken a look at a lot of doujin games here on Bullet Heaven, and perhaps the biggest concentration of these games have come from Astro. Gigantic Army, Supercharged Robot Volkaiser, Armed 7, Steel Strider, Wolfflame, and more have been seen here so far, and each offers a great package that plays well at a great price point. Nyu-Media has published nearly all of Astroport's games in the West, and their latest, Zangeki Warp, is no exception. Zangeki Warp might seem like a run-of-the-mill horizontal scrolling shooter, but it doesn't take long to see that it has some nifty twists under the hood. Let's take a closer look. Zangeki Warp is a shooting game that places a lot of emphasis on players thoughtfully making their way through each stage, not only with sheer firepower, but also a hefty dose of patience, memorization, and strategy. At first, simply shooting everything on screen by pressing the A button on an Xbox pad is all players really need to do. But very early on, impassable barriers will prevent a player's progress under normal traditional means. This is where the warp mechanic comes into play. Holding the X button pauses the action on screen and displays a circle which represents the Zan fighter's exit point from its warp ability. Players can choose to warp anywhere on screen and are given a certain amount of time to do so, indicated by the warp gauge on the bottom of the screen. When the warp button is released, the Zan fighter will instantly move to the selected point. If the gauge depletes completely, the player will pop out in places they may not be prepared to. But when the warp is not in use, the warp gauge gradually recovers its power. Players can also uncover shield items which build a defensive barrier around the Zan fighter. As these small purple heart icons are collected, the shield gauge is gradually filled, and the barrier is activated when this gauge is full. This barrier will help in killing small enemies or nullifying a small shot that might have otherwise destroyed the Zan fighter. There are even additional abilities that create a shockwave that bursts out as an offensive counterattack when the barrier is destroyed. As such, care should obviously be taken. Warping onto an enemy will destroy the Zan fighter instantly, as will warping into a wall or emplacement. However, players can warp through enemies, and so long as there is empty space where the Zan ship exits the warp, everything between point A and point B will be damaged or destroyed as a result. This warp slash, paired with the main shot, is all that a player really needs to make progress in the game at a basic level, but there are additional features which enhance the Zan fighter and make things easier for its pilot. At game start and between each stage, ability points can be distributed among a number of different attributes on the Zan fighter. The more a player powers up certain abilities, the more additional features open up. Enhancements to the main cannon, warp slash damage, enhanced auto shield recovery, warp gauge recovery, and new abilities like the Omega Crash and decoys are all available to tweak to the player's liking. Knowing how each ability best suits the player's playstyle will help in making the game as a whole easier to get through. In our case, huge cannon power and fast shield and warp recovery were the priority. The decoy ability also made things quite a bit easier when dealing with huge enemy mobs. With a total of 7 stages, players have quite a bit of game to chew through, and there are some really creative mid- and end-stage bosses to challenge players on early runs. Especially early on, a few runs will be required to register where most hazards and traps are. With this in mind, the challenge really just gives way to a healthy amount of memorization and ship enhancements on the whole. The overall replay value may be limited in this respect for some players, but for most others, the additional difficulties are sure to keep the good times rolling. Steam leaderboards also enhance the replay, as playing Zangeki Warp to get as high a score as possible is sure to have score chasers busy for a while, especially when working out how to kill off as many enemies as possible. Finally, there isn't much to say in terms of outright negative aspects to Zangeki Warp, save for one. When assigning ability points at game start or between stages, players have really got to make sure they've made the right choices. When a point is assigned, there's no taking it back, and the game starts or continues immediately as the final point is placed. A little more forgiveness and a confirmation button should really have been present. Despite this, Zangeki Warp has a very solid gameplay style. With options for newbies and veterans alike, there's a good time to be had here by all. By and large, the scoring in Zangeki Warp is extremely straightforward. Basically, killing as many enemies and emplacements as possible will net the player a high score. Because there is so much stuff to destroy in parts of the stage that require careful warp timing, this can be challenging for people looking to squeeze as high a number out of the game as possible. Impressive for such a basic score system, and fun too. At stage end, bonus points are awarded for collecting as many shield pickups as possible during the stage, as well as a stage result rank, which awards a letter grade and additional bonus points in conjunction with it. The amount of times a player dies and whether the boss is defeated within the allotted time limit factor into this extra score, so perfecting each stage and taking out as many enemies as possible is definitely key to getting the biggest scores on the Steam leaderboards. Zangeki Warp has a trademark look and sound that screams Astroport at the top of its lungs. Though there is a certain lack of quality to it all, it's far from terrible, and it's almost to be expected from such a small group. Though we were pleasantly surprised with a few things. Visually, Zangeki Warp is competent with the kind of pixel art we've come to know and expect of Astroport. There is a lot of rotation-based animation, but also much more frame-based stuff in the sprites as well. The animation is a little choppy, but we appreciate the effort to make things look a lot less static. The backgrounds are often fairly drab as well, but some stages have a really cool Mode 7 style perspective shift to them as players make their way through the level. A good amount of parallax also gives the game a fair amount of visual depth as well. Some of the sprites are really tiny though, and can sometimes sneak up on a player through the chaos without them realizing. Zangeki Warp is the first Astroport game to run in 720p, and as a result, the sprites here seem much smaller than usual. Despite this though, the UI elements are a bit on the blurry side, which makes them a bit jarring in comparison to the rest of the game. Still, on the whole, the visuals work and the boss designs are really cool and creative. On the sound front, Zangeki Warp has all of the Dojin hallmarks we've seen in many other Dojin titles, with a lot of the same stock sound effects at play. More variety could have been used in the case of the explosions. Even really early games like Star Soldier have a huge variance in its explosion sounds, and it goes a very long way. Meanwhile, the music has a completely different feel than many other Astroport games, which definitely freshens things up. But there's also that signature Astroport sound underlying the whole thing, which gives the OST a familiar feel as well. It's great on the whole, and unlike Wolf Flame, the pieces are longer and loop much more naturally. Excellent. Finally, Zangeki Warp's UI is clean and easy to navigate. There's very little confusion as to where players need to go to access any of the options or to start the game. This approach is, once again, classic Astroport. Rounding out the presentation, Steam achievements and trading cards are also present for players to take their game even further. So, how does Zangeki Warp stack up? Let's take a look. The control in Zangeki Warp is solid and simple, but maybe not 100% there. It works, but it could be sharper. Zangeki Warp definitely has chops in the difficulty department at first blush, but can be overcome easily with memorization and strategic power-ups. At 7 stages, there's plenty of length to Zangeki Warp, and with online leaderboards, multiple difficulties, and over 50 achievements, there's a lot to do as well. The visuals in Zangeki Warp are typical of Astroport. Drab backgrounds, blurry UI, and simple animation make things a little rougher on the edges, but there are some really cool touches that still make it a good-looking game. Sound-wise, the OST is a bit of a departure from your typical Astroport fare in Zangeki Warp. The explosions need more variety though. In terms of ingenuity, Zangeki Warp has a lot going for it, especially with the upgrade system and the sweet warping mechanic. However, the PSP and PS3 Mini Velocity beat Astroport to the punch with its own, albeit much simpler, warp mechanic in 2012. At just $6, the asking price is just right for the super solid experience that Zangeki Warp delivers. You can buy this one with confidence. So far, Astroport has really done no wrong. If you want a fairly fresh take on horizontal shooting, make sure to download Zangeki Warp today. Zangeki Warp gets a 4 out of 5. You can download your very own copy of Zangeki Warp today on Steam for just $6. We have played quite a few Astroport games so far, but a few are notably absent in North America. The cool tank shooter Steam Action Adventum and Super Tank Warfare Adventure are both games that we'd love to see localized. Maybe sometime in the future we'll see these great looking games on Steam, and maybe even Astroport's upcoming action shooter Rocketron. In the meantime, be sure to check out these other reviews on Astroport games we've done in the past.